In the dark, glacial-fed waterways of the Laurentian Basin, an ecological drama has been unfolding for decades, one that reveals how easily human intervention can shatter an ecosystem and how complex the road to recovery truly is. Up here, along the critical river corridors feeding the Canadian Shield and the St. Lawrence Seaway, the water tells a story of disruption. In the late 20th century, invasive silver carp escaped containment, pushed into interconnected river networks, and claimed the aquatic system for themselves. In the most heavily impacted reaches, these relentless filter feeders exploded in density, accounting for upwards of 70% of the total fish biomass. The response was swift, frantic, and costly. Resource management agencies and federal authorities threw every engineering marvel they could muster at the problem. They routed high-voltage electrical dispersal barriers through shipping canals to shock advancing schools downstream. Environmental crews applied targeted pesticides to clear out entire stretches of water. Public funds poured into massive infrastructure projects, accumulating into multi-hundred-million-dollar defensive barriers designed to seal off the Great Lakes system. Yet season after season, the carp kept pushing forward. Then, a few years ago, the narrative took a sudden turn. In the upper stretches of the river network, near key lock systems and provincial parks, carp populations began to plummet on their own. The dense, churning schools that once choked the currents started to thin out. Intrigued by the shift, field biologists and aquatic ecologists launched monitoring surveys to uncover the mechanism behind the crash. What they discovered turned every existing assumption upside down. To grasp why these invasive fish are receding today, you have to look back to how they conquered these northern watersheds. The story begins decades ago, far to the south, where commercial aquaculture operations faced a persistent problem. Production ponds choked with thick algae blooms. Seeking a biological solution, operators imported a species native to Asia, a fish that exists to consume massive quantities of microflora. Drop a handful into a closed pond, and the water stays crystal clear. It was a remarkably effective strategy until containment failed. Severe regional flooding allowed the carp to escape landlocked ponds into open river systems. Within a decade, they were spawning throughout the massive continental river basin, migrating northward toward Canadian waters. These invaders possess a reproductive output native species cannot match. A single mature female silver carp can broadcast hundreds of thousands of eggs in one spawning event, sometimes topping 1 million over a warm season. Multiply that by tens of thousands of fish in the same stretch of river, and the scale of the invasion becomes terrifying. Their feeding habits compound the damage. A silver carp swims continuously with its mouth agape, straining microplankton directly out of the water column through specialized gill rakers. They consume the very foundation of the aquatic food web. That microscopic plankton is the non-negotiable food source for virtually every native Canadian species, from newly hatched fry to juvenile gamefish. By monopolizing the base of the ecosystem, the carp effectively starve out everything above them. The ecological fallout can be measured directly in the field. Consider the gizzard shad, a critical native forage fish relying on that exact plankton. Native predator species like walleye, northern pike, and channel catfish depend on healthy shad populations to sustain the regional food web. Once the invasive carp established themselves, native shad populations shrank and suffered massive mortality simply because invaders were stripping the table clean. The exact same trajectory hit the bigmouth buffalo. Bit by bit, invaders were quietly starving out resident fish that inhabited these waterways for millennia. Within years, invaders took complete control of the ecosystem. In central river channels, monitoring surveys recorded staggering densities. Over 1,200 individual carp packed into every single linear kilometer of water. Pulling a commercial gill net out yielded an overwhelming mass of silver carp, with perhaps a lone native walleye gasping for air amidst hundreds of kilograms of invasive biomass. And then there is the physical hazard. Silver carp possess a unique fright response. When startled by the deep vibration of an outboard motor, a 10-pound fish will leap straight out of the water, launching up to 3 meters into the air. Picture navigating a boat at 40 kilometers per hour down a narrow river channel, while hard, heavy fish rain down around you. Marine safety logs are filled with accounts of the damage these airborne projectiles inflict on boaters. Severe concussions, fractured jaws, deep lacerations, and passengers knocked cold right off their seats. This was an ecological crisis Canadian provincial and federal authorities simply could not ignore. The river systems run directly toward major municipal centers and industrial shipping channels, connecting through managed canal routes straight into the Great Lakes Basin. The Great Lakes represent the world's largest surface freshwater system, supplying clean drinking water to over 40 million people across both sides of the border and underpinning a commercial and recreational fishery valued at well over $7 billion annually. Should these invasive filter feeders gain a permanent foothold in those expansive deep-water habitats, they would trigger the exact same ecological collapse currently ravaging tributary rivers. Stripping the plankton base bare, collapsing native food webs, and establishing absolute dominance over the entire watershed. In response, government agencies threw massive financial resources at the problem. Public works crews installed complex electrical barrier arrays directly into shipping corridors dozens of kilometers downstream of the lakes, firing high-voltage pulses into the current to shock advancing fish back down the river. Following that initial setup, environmental agencies launched an even more ambitious effort, a multi-hundred-million-dollar infrastructure overhaul at key navigation lock bottlenecks, featuring underwater acoustic sound walls, dense air bubble curtains, and enhanced electrical grids designed to block that single, vital entry point. Hundreds of millions of public dollars were committed to hold the line, yet carp continued to reproduce faster than environmental management teams could extract them. Faced with an escalating crisis, wildlife managers and the public began searching for alternative solutions. Rather than attempting to engineer an impenetrable artificial wall, people began asking a fundamental question. What if a massive apex predator already native to these northern waters could do the work for us? As it turns out, our native ecosystems once hosted a legendary giant that fit that description perfectly, a species virtually wiped out from these northern reaches for over half a century, the alligator gar. Imagine a prehistoric river monster capable of growing up to 2.5 meters in length and weighing over 140 kilograms. In Canadian freshwaters, only the ancient lake sturgeon approaches that sheer mass. The gar is built like an armored submarine, featuring a long, broad snout packed with a double row of needle-sharp teeth and a body protected by interlocking, diamond-shaped ganoid scales so tough they can turn away steel blades. This is an ancient lineage, a living fossil that stalked these northern river networks long before the ice sheets receded. For millions of years, it sat at the absolute top of the aquatic food web across North American river basins, striking at anything that swam within reach. Then came human settlement, and the gar was systematically wiped out from its northern range. Early commercial fishers and rural communities viewed the toothy giant with intense disdain, labeling it a destructive trash fish that ruined gear and ate valuable game species. They hunted it with rifles, snagged it with heavy gear, and dragged thousands onto riverbanks to rot in the sun. At the same time, massive civil engineering projects altered the natural hydrology of the landscape. Authorities lined river channels with levees, installed flood control dams, and permanently cut the gar off from shallow, vegetated floodplains required for its spring spawning runs. Deprived of critical breeding grounds, the species disappeared from northern waters, state by state and province by province. The last documented native sightings in northern tributary waters occurred back in the mid-1960s. By the late 1990s, regional conservation authorities officially declared the species extirpated from northern inland rivers that the apex predator was gone. But the dream of bringing it back soon took hold. In the late 1990s, federal wildlife agencies and provincial conservation hatcheries began attempting to raise alligator gar in captivity, aiming to reintroduce self-sustaining populations into historic northern river channels. By 2010, environmental crews were regularly stocking young gar into targeted tributary waters, When you place these two elements side by side in the public consciousness, the narrative seems almost irresistible. An ancient, heavily armored native predator with a mouthful of sharp teeth, returning to the exact river system that a foreign filter feeder had just completely overwhelmed. The public and local political leaders quickly did what seemed like obvious arithmetic. Bring back the largest native predator in the watershed and turn it loose to devour the invasive carp. The concept spread like wildfire through municipal halls and legislative chambers. Regional politicians pushed provincial authorities to accelerate the gar stocking initiative, going on the official record to declare that the alligator gar was the one native fish large enough to swallow a mature invasive carp whole. To the general public, it felt like the ultimate ecological fairy tale. Restore an ancient native giant, rescue the freshwater system, and accomplish it all at virtually zero ongoing cost to taxpayers. There was only one glaring problem with this story. The fisheries scientists, aquatic ecologists, and hatchery managers who actually raised the gar and hauled them to the river stated flatly that the idea was an absolute fantasy. Senior directors at provincial natural resource departments made it explicitly clear that stocking programs had nothing whatsoever to do with managing silver carp. The sole objective was native species restoration, returning an extirpated apex predator to its historical northern waters and providing sports anglers with an incredible native fish to target. As field biologists explained repeatedly, the gar would have zero meaningful impact on the invasive carp population. You only have to look at raw population data to understand why. Over a 4-year period, stocking programs released approximately 6,000 juvenile gar into regional waters. The vast majority perished while still small due to natural mortality, leaving only about 1,500 individuals that survived to adulthood. Holding 1,500 solitary predators up against millions of kilograms of silver carp distributed across hundreds of kilometers of open river is like throwing a single bucket of water onto a roaring forest fire. Furthermore, even a fully grown alligator gar is physically incapable of eating the carp that people imagined. A mature silver carp is a wide, heavy-bodied fish over 30 centimeters long. A gar's narrow, elongated snout has a rigid anatomical constraint on how wide its gape can open, meaning it can only swallow prey up to a very specific, limited size. A gar can easily take a juvenile silver carp during its first few months of life, but after that brief window, the fast-growing carp completely outgrows the gar's mouth and spends the rest of its life swimming in complete safety. At best, a modest population of gar could nip at the absolute fringes of a single spawning cohort before the survivors grew too large to eat. Yet despite biologists repeating these facts year after year, news outlets ran national headlines hailing the gar as the ultimate biological weapon sent to reclaim Canadian waterways. The public locked on to that clean, dramatic picture, an ancient river monster returning to destroy invaders, ignoring scientific reality in favor of a comforting hero story. However, while the legendary monster was a dead end, carp really were vanishing from upper river reaches near key provincial park boundaries. Population numbers were dropping sharply year after year. It just had nothing to do with gar. Instead, the real recovery was driven by two unglamorous forces nobody put on a conservation poster. The first force was relentlessly practical: financial incentives and commercial harvesting. Provincial authorities began offering direct cash bounties to commercial fishing crews for every kilogram of carp pulled from the water. Fisheries programs paid a guaranteed rate per pound, plus additional seasonal bonuses, turning invasive carp removal into a lucrative business. Commercial fishers went all in, deploying heavy gear and extracting a staggering volume of biomass. Over a 15-year period, commercial crews hauled roughly 22 million kilograms of carp out of the main river corridor alone, with cumulative regional harvests topping 35 million kilograms. They accomplished this massive harvest using high-efficiency techniques adapted from Asian river operations, known as the unified method. Crews stretched long net barriers across river channels, then used engine noise and acoustic drivers to herd carp forward like livestock into progressively smaller netted enclosures until thousands of fish were packed tightly together for a single massive haul. A single coordinated sweep could net upwards of 350,000 kilograms of carp in one continuous operation. Teams even turned the carp's social behavior against them, fitting captured fish with acoustic telemetry tags before releasing them back into the river. These tagged Judas fish swam straight back to massive schooling aggregations, leading tracking boats directly to hidden schools so crews could encircle the entire group at once. By concentrating harvest pressure on the leading edge of the invasion, near major lock structures, crews systematically removed mature breeding adults before they could spawn, cutting off the next generation at the source. Alongside targeted commercial extraction, provincial agencies tried an even more creative tactic, creating a commercial culinary market for the invader. Silver carp feature clean, firm white meat that is low in environmental toxins like mercury. Yet consumers consistently rejected the fish due to the negative historical reputation associated with the word carp. To overcome this branding hurdle, government marketing initiatives invested heavily to rebrand the fish under a clean, appealing name, Copi, derived from their sheer abundance. Resource agencies partnered with commercial fish processors and executive chefs to introduce Copi burgers, fish cakes, and tacos into restaurants and retail supply chains across the region. The logic was simple: generate consumer demand, and commercial fishers would haul even more tons out of the river to supply the market. The initiative was an immediate success, extracting millions of kilograms of invasive biomass within the first few months of rollout. That was the first force: human muscle, heavy nets, and consumer dinner plates dragging tons of invasive fish out of the river daily. The second force, however, was something no resource manager ever planned. It turns out that urban industrial legacy pollution in major municipal river corridors was creating a chemical barrier that blocked the carp's advance. As silver carp pushed up the river network toward the Great Lakes Basin, their rapid expansion suddenly ground to a complete halt about 80 kilometers downstream of the major metropolitan shipping hub. They stalled out at that exact location for more than a decade. Intrigued by this invisible wall, aquatic toxicologists from regional universities launched a comprehensive study to investigate why. Earlier genetic testing had already revealed that silver carp inhabiting those specific river reaches were exhibiting severe cellular stress markers, the exact physiological response expected in fish swimming through heavily contaminated industrial runoff. Researchers conducted controlled laboratory exposure tests, placing juvenile silver carp into water samples collected from that polluted corridor. In clean, unpolluted water, juvenile carp swam actively and explored their environment normally. But when placed in water from the industrial stretch, the fish became sluggish almost immediately, suffering acute physiological distress. Senior aquatic biologists leading the research explained the mechanism. As fish attempt to push upstream toward the industrial core, the concentration of municipal runoff and chemical contaminants increases sharply. For a silver carp, simply surviving in that degraded water consumes so much metabolic energy that the fish actively choose to turn around rather than push forward. Decades of heavy urban runoff and industrial discharge had created an invisible chemical barrier in the shipping channel that the invasive carp refused to cross. That chemical wall is further reinforced by physical barriers along the urban river corridor. Near the industrial center, natural riverbanks have been replaced by steep concrete retaining walls, completely eliminating shallow, vegetated backwaters required for spawning. Heavy navigation locks and flow control dams further fragment the river, preventing fish movement. Combined with constant targeted harvest pressure downstream, the advance toward the Great Lakes Basin was effectively frozen. Today, that defensive line continues to hold. The front line of the invasion remains stalled 80 kilometers away from the lakes. While a few isolated individual carp have occasionally slipped past warning zones over the years, each extracted by emergency response crews within miles of the lakefront, intensive eDNA monitoring and netting surveys confirm that no breeding population has ever established a foothold in the Great Lakes Basin. Yet, this balance remains remarkably fragile. The barrier holding back the invasion isn't an ancient toothy river monster or a single silver bullet solution. It is a complex, continuous effort powered by commercial fishing crews earning per-pound bounties, diners ordering fresh fish at local restaurants, and the unintended benefit of historic industrial water pollution. The long-term defense still depends heavily on infrastructure. Permanent engineering works, featuring sophisticated acoustic arrays, electric grids, and lock flushing systems, are being built at critical choke points along the river network. But funding disputes between federal, provincial, and regional authorities have repeatedly threatened construction schedules and frozen the vital grant programs that keep commercial netting crews on the water. The moment funding stalls and nets are pulled, the carp's reproductive potential remains as dangerous as ever. One mature female can still drop over 1 million eggs in a single season, ready to repopulate the upper river if human pressure wanes. Meanwhile, the alligator gar continues its quiet, steady return. Stocking programs introduce young gar into historical northern tributaries each spring, where they are gradually rebuilding wild, self-sustaining populations. It is a triumph of native species restoration, a prehistoric giant returning to the river systems from which human action once erased it. But as for saving the watershed from the carp invasion, the ancient monster everyone cheered for never lifted a fin. The true burden of protecting our waters fell, as it always does, back onto us.